I call Dr David Clark.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Labor will support this bill because we back the policy objective that's behind it, which is to collect information on offshore residential home buyers. However, as my colleague Grant Robertson has already begun to canvass, there are a large number of loopholes and weaknesses in this bill, and that is as a result of a government obsessed with wanting to look like it's doing something and actually making sure that it is not. And no clearer example of that than, of course, the paperboy tax legislation that we saw in a previous budget, where the government shifted things around to make it look like it was doing something, but actually created a grey economy where there was none before, and created extra red tape and overhead for many who were doing those part-time jobs and for employers as well. Likewise with child support, requiring employers to collect child support arrears where they didn't previously, is an extra red tape burden that this government has imposed on employers. And here we have an example of additional red tape, but red tape applied without an offsetting assurance that we're actually achieving the policy objective. And that is worrying, because poor legislation does introduce costs to an economy. Cost puts an individual burden of cost on people, ordinary citizens, and when no offsetting gain can be guaranteed, that is a worrying thing. It's Parliament's job to actually try and get this legislation right, to make sure that we do have sensible decisions that don't cause extra compliance on ordinary citizens, and that try to solve the problems that we see as a country. And no one these days would say that offshore property speculation is not a problem in New Zealand. I think even the government acknowledges that offshore property speculation is a problem. At least that's the rhetoric, and at least that's the driving reason behind bills like this one. But as to actually doing something about it in a sensible, measured way, in a way that answers the questions of policy advisors, well, that is a different question altogether. And so what we saw in the regulatory impact statement and in the advice from the IRD was advice that they are unable to estimate the compliance costs or consult on this legislation because there wasn't enough time to do it. So they have not estimated what the cost of this legislation is, what the overhead that goes with it is, and whether it in fact is going to be as effective as it could be, because the government has placed time constraints on this legislation in order to rush it through Parliament, to be seen to be doing something about the problem that we are facing as a country. The IRD also recommended to the government that they do not exempt main homes from the register because it will not reduce compliance costs for purchases of a main home, as almost all would have a New Zealand IRD number anyway. And it will make rules more complicated for purchasers and conveyancers and create loopholes. Now, there's a whole set of reasons why this legislation shouldn't have been rushed through, why it should have had a second look, why the government should have taken its time to make sure that it was right, that it was actually achieving the goal, the stated goal of cracking down on that overseas property speculation. But of course, what we suspect on this side of the House is a certain amount of cynicism from the government opposite. We know that they are not actually particularly interested in cracking down on property speculators. We've seen little evidence of it. They've been willing to take a bit of a political hit on it over the years, where they have been so responsive in other areas to polling and to their focus groups and so on. In this area, we begin to suspect that they have other interests at play, and so they are not wanting to crack down in this area in the same way. And so they seem to be quite happy to let some of those loopholes remain. And I think people can probably draw their own conclusions as to why that might be. So, Mr Speaker, we will support it because it is a first step toward achieving the goal, and we recognise that when we are in government, that a Labor-led government will have to tidy this up, to tighten it up, to make sure that it actually does what the policy intention, the stated policy intention originally was. A government that is not straight with New Zealanders is going to run into problems over the longer term. I think, Mr. Speaker, it's fair to say that this theme of saying that they're going to do one thing and then not delivering on it is wearing a little thin with New Zealanders who are now seeing this government as increasingly out of touch. Mr. Speaker, the bill says that it supports the government's yet to be introduced legislation to create a new 2-year bright line income tax test for Auckland, the test that is not a capital gains tax, but that supports the government's that tax on property gains over time. We will be debating that later, I believe. In fact, it might be the next bill on the order paper. So we see it as a part of a package that the government is putting together to be seen to be doing something in this area. But we are mindful on this side of the House that these new measures, while they will improve on the current complete lack of information regarding overseas house purchases, are but a part measure. They are needlessly weak. And as Grant Robertson said in his contribution, those on the Select Committee heard ways in which the legislation could be made stronger, and we can only deduce that the Select Committee itself, by burden of a government majority, decided against putting that recommendation through to the Parliament and opted instead to adopt the weakened bill that we have before us. And it is disappointing that Parliament and the Committee will need to visit this legislation again in the future to amend the inadequacies of this bill. Implementing a full and proper overseas home buyers register the first time around would save wasting a whole lot of parliamentary time, and the cost of putting a bill through this Parliament is quite extraordinary. I remember seeing an estimate. It's hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of dollars to put a bill through this Parliament when one takes into account the staff time, all of the salaries sitting in this room, the lighting, and the advisors for the Select Committee process and so on. It is a huge amount of money to put a bill through this House, and so that is why we find it frustrating that the government wants to put through a half measure that will almost certainly have to be revisited, and that it's so obvious as we put it through this House that it's a half measure, that it's needlessly weak and kowtows perhaps to propertied speculator interests, rather than taking a principled stance and saying, how do we rebalance the New Zealand economy? How do we make sure that we tackle the issue of a housing market in Auckland that has been out of control for some time, where we have homelessness in our streets and growing social issues as a consequence? And how do we make sure that the market is set to respond? How do we make sure that we actually have a country that is focused on productive activity, that sets the incentives up right, that makes sure that overseas speculation doesn't drive our currency and our housing and our economy? How do we get focused on the issues that matter and on generating a better New Zealand? So for all the costs involved in putting this bill through Parliament, we would have liked to have seen proper, strong, robust legislation. Instead, we have the kind of legislation that you might expect from a government that is arrogantly pressing ahead, saying we're not going to listen to anyone, we just want to be seen to be doing something, tick that box, move on. A government that is increasingly out of touch with ordinary New Zealanders. In the middle are getting squeezed, and here again, they will get squeezed by this legislation. They'll be the ones, Middle New Zealand will be the ones who comply with this legislation, while the speculators find the loopholes and carry on as they were. And Mr. Bishop, I'm sure, is going to stand up shortly and say this is all wrong, but if he'd addressed the questions that were raised, both by Mr. Robertson and myself, adequately now, it'd be a wonder to many that he didn't do that in the Select Committee.
I call Chris Bishop.